The autumn mist clung to the wooden structures of Salem's Edge like a shroud. The settlement's 23 families huddled against the Massachusetts wilderness as if the forest itself harbored demons. In 1785, 3 years after the last witch trial had stained nearby Salem with blood, the Puritan community of Salem's Edge existed in a perpetual state of spiritual vigilance where every shadow could conceal sin and every whisper might carry heresy. Ezekiel Whitmore stood at the pulpit of the modest meeting house, his gaunt frame casting a long shadow across the rough-hewn pews. At 52, the Patriarch possessed the kind of presence that made grown men lower their eyes and children press closer to their mothers. His voice, deep and resonant, filled every corner of the sacred space as he delivered his Sunday sermon. "The Lord tests those he loves most dearly," Ezekiel proclaimed, his pale blue eyes scanning the congregation with the intensity of a hawk surveying prey. "And in these times of moral decay, when the very foundations of our faith are assaulted by the wickedness of the world, we must be prepared to make sacrifices that lesser men would find difficult to comprehend." In the third pew, Martha Blackwood shifted uncomfortably, her 3 sons seated beside her in order of age. Thomas, 17 and broad-shouldered from years of farm work, kept his eyes fixed on his calloused hands. Samuel, 15, possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that made the settlement's young women blush and look away. The youngest, Benjamin, barely 13, still carried the soft features of childhood, though his dark eyes held an intelligence that often unnerved adults. The boy's father, Jonathan Blackwood, had perished the previous winter when a tree fell during a logging expedition. Since then, Ezekiel had taken what he called a paternal interest in the family's spiritual welfare, visiting their modest farmhouse with increasing frequency. Martha had initially welcomed the Patriarch's attention, grateful for his guidance during her time of grief. But lately, his visits had taken on a quality that made her skin crawl with unspoken dread. Scripture tells us that Abraham was willing to sacrifice his beloved Isaac. Ezekiel continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every ear. Not because God demanded blood, but because true faith requires the surrender of that which we hold most precious. The flesh, my brothers and sisters, is weak. It is through the mortification of the flesh that we achieve spiritual purity. The congregation murmured their agreement, though several mothers instinctively pulled their children closer. In Salem's Edge, Ezekiel's word was law, his interpretation of Scripture the only truth that mattered. The nearest magistrate was a 3-day journey through dangerous wilderness, and the settlement had learned to govern itself according to the Patriarch's divine revelations. After the service, as families dispersed to their Sunday meals, Ezekiel approached the Blackwood family with measured steps. His black coat, worn but meticulously maintained, rustled softly in the crisp October air. "Sister Martha," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of honey over steel, "I trust you and the boys will join me for evening prayers tonight. There are matters of spiritual importance we must discuss." Martha's throat constricted. These evening prayer sessions had become more frequent since Jonathan's death, and each one left her feeling as though something vital had been drained from her soul. But to refuse the Patriarch's invitation would be tantamount to declaring oneself in rebellion against God's chosen representative. "Of course, Patriarch Whitmore," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "We are honored by your continued guidance." Thomas looked up sharply, something flickering in his brown eyes that might have been fear or anger. Samuel remained perfectly still, as if hoping invisibility might protect him from whatever was coming. Benjamin, however, met Ezekiel's gaze directly, and for a moment the Patriarch's composure seemed to waver. "Excellent," Ezekiel said, his thin lips curving into what might charitably be called a smile. "The Lord has shown me visions, Sister Martha. Visions of purification and sacrifice that will elevate this community to heights of spiritual glory. Your sons, they have been chosen for a sacred purpose." The words hung in the air like a curse, and Martha felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Around them, the other families continued their quiet conversations, unaware that something monstrous had just been set in motion. As the Blackwoods walked home through the settlement's narrow dirt paths, past the blacksmith's forge and the general store, none of them spoke. The weight of Ezekiel's words pressed down upon them like a physical thing, and each step toward their small farmhouse felt like a march toward an inevitable doom. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the tree line and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the Blackwood family made their way to the Patriarch's residence. The large wooden house stood at the settlement's center, its windows glowing with candlelight that cast dancing shadows on the walls within. Ezekiel greeted them at the door, now dressed in a simple white robe that made his pale skin appear almost translucent. Behind him, the house seemed to breathe with shadows, and the air carried the scent of burning herbs and something else, something organic and unsettling. "Come," he said, gesturing them inside. "The Lord's work awaits, and his patience grows thin with delay." As they crossed the threshold, Martha caught sight of several other men from the settlement's inner circle. Deacon Cornelius Marsh, Elder Tobias Crane, and Brother Jeremiah Hale. All wore the same white robes, and all watched the Blackwood boys with expressions that made Martha's maternal instincts scream warnings she dared not voice. The door closed behind them with a sound like a coffin lid sealing shut, and in that moment, Martha Blackwood realized that whatever happened in this house tonight would change their lives forever, if they survived it at all. The interior of Ezekiel's house had been transformed since Martha's last visit. The familiar furniture had been pushed against the walls, creating a large open space in the main room. Candles arranged in precise geometric patterns cast flickering shadows that seemed to writhe and dance with malevolent life. The wooden floors, normally covered with simple braided rugs, were now bare except for strange symbols chalked in white. Symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they contained some forbidden knowledge that the human mind was not meant to comprehend. "Please be seated," Ezekiel instructed, gesturing to a row of wooden chairs that had been arranged facing what appeared to be a makeshift altar. The altar itself was nothing more than a rough wooden table covered with a white cloth, but upon it rested items that made Martha's blood run cold. A leather-bound book that was definitely not a Bible, several gleaming metal instruments that looked disturbingly surgical in nature, and a collection of glass vials containing liquids of various colors. Thomas, Samuel, and Benjamin sat in uncomfortable silence, their eyes darting between the strange setup and the robed men who watched them with unsettling intensity. Martha took her place beside her youngest son, fighting the urge to gather all three boys and flee into the night. "Brothers," Ezekiel addressed the other men, his voice taking on a ceremonial quality that echoed strangely in the transformed space. "Tonight we witness the fulfillment of divine prophecy. The Lord has spoken to me in dreams and visions, revealing the path to ultimate purification for our community." Deacon Marsh, a thin man with nervous hands and darting eyes, stepped forward. "Patriarch, are we certain this is the Lord's will? The methods you've described seem extreme." Ezekiel's gaze fixed on the deacon with laser-like intensity. "Do you question the word of God, Brother Marsh? Do you doubt the visions he has granted me?" His voice carried a dangerous edge that made everyone in the room tense. "Perhaps you would prefer to return to the spiritual complacency that allowed witchcraft to flourish in Salem. Perhaps you believe our community is pure enough as it stands." "No, Patriarch," Marsh replied quickly, his face pale. "Forgive my moment of weakness. The Lord's will be done." "Indeed it shall," Ezekiel said, turning his attention back to the Blackwood family. "Sister Martha, your sons have been chosen because of their purity, their innocence. But innocence alone is not enough. True spiritual elevation requires sacrifice, the sacrifice of that which makes us most human, most vulnerable to the temptations of the flesh. Martha's voice came out as barely a whisper. What? What exactly are you asking of us, Patriarch? Ezekiel opened the leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age and covered in text that definitely was not English. As he began to read in a language that sounded like Latin, mixed with something far older and more sinister, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The ancient texts speak of purification through removal, he explained, his finger tracing lines of incomprehensible script. The source of carnal desire, the root of masculine pride and lust, must be severed to achieve true spiritual transcendence. Your sons will become as angels, pure, devoted, incapable of the sins that plague ordinary men. The meaning of his words hit Martha like a physical blow. She shot to her feet, her maternal instincts finally overriding her fear of the patriarch's authority. "No," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "No, I will not allow you to harm my children. We're leaving, now." But as she turned toward the door, she found Elder Crane blocking her path, his bulk filling the doorway like an immovable mountain. Behind her, she heard the scrape of chairs as the other men moved to surround her sons. "Sister Martha," Ezekiel said, his voice now carrying a tone of disappointed patience, "I understand your maternal concerns, but you must trust in the Lord's plan. Your sons will thank you for this gift when they experience the spiritual clarity that comes with freedom from carnal temptation." Thomas, the eldest, finally found his voice. "You're talking about castration," he said, the word hanging in the air like a curse. "You want to mutilate us in the name of God." "Mutilation?" Ezekiel's laugh was cold and humorless. "My dear boy, this is elevation. This is transformation from base animal to divine servant. The greatest saints and mystics throughout history have understood that the flesh must be conquered for the spirit to soar." Samuel, who had remained silent until now, began to tremble visibly. At 15, he was old enough to understand exactly what was being proposed, and the implications filled him with a terror so profound it seemed to paralyze his vocal cords. Benjamin, the youngest, looked around the room with eyes that seemed far too old for his 13-year-old face. "And if we refuse?" he asked quietly. Ezekiel's expression hardened. "Refusal is not an option, child. The Lord has spoken, and his will shall be done. You may submit willingly and receive his blessing, or you may resist and face his wrath. But the outcome will be the same." Brother Hale, who had been silent until now, stepped forward with a length of rope in his hands. "Perhaps it would be easier if they were restrained, Patriarch. The flesh is weak, and fear often overwhelms faith in moments of trial." Martha lunged toward her sons, but Elder Crane's massive hands caught her arms, holding her fast. "Let them go!" she screamed, her voice breaking with desperation. "They're just children. Please, I'll do anything, give anything, but don't hurt my boys." "You are giving something, Sister Martha," Ezekiel replied calmly, beginning to arrange his surgical instruments with the precision of a man who had done this before. "You are giving them eternal salvation. You are ensuring that they will never fall prey to the lusts and desires that damn so many souls to hell." As the robed men moved to restrain the three brothers, Thomas made a desperate attempt to fight back, his farm-strengthened muscles straining against his captors, but he was outnumbered and overwhelmed, and within moments all three boys were bound to chairs that had been positioned near the makeshift altar. The candlelight flickered across their terrified faces as Ezekiel approached with his instruments, and Martha's screams echoed through the house like the cries of the damned. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows as if the very elements were protesting the abomination about to unfold within those walls. "Let us begin," Ezekiel intoned, raising a gleaming blade toward the ceiling. "In the name of purity, in the name of salvation, in the name of the Lord who demands sacrifice from those he loves most." The first cut silenced even Martha's desperate pleas. Thomas, bound to the chair with rope that cut into his wrists, threw his head back in a scream that seemed to tear from the very depths of his soul. The sound was inhuman, primal, a noise that no 17-year-old should ever have to make. Ezekiel worked with the methodical precision of a butcher, his white robes slowly staining crimson as he performed what he called the Lord's purification. "Hold him steady," the Patriarch commanded, his voice eerily calm despite the horror he was inflicting. Deacon Marsh and Brother Hale gripped Thomas's shoulders, their faces pale but determined. Elder Crane maintained his iron grip on Martha, who had collapsed to her knees, her voice hoarse from screaming. Samuel and Benjamin watched in paralyzed terror, knowing their turns were coming. The younger boy had gone completely silent, his dark eyes wide and unblinking, as if his mind had retreated to some safe place where this nightmare couldn't reach him. Samuel, however, sobbed openly, his body shaking so violently that the chair creaked beneath him. "Please," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible over his brother's agonized cries. "Please, I'll do anything. I'll pray every day, I'll never sin, I'll serve God faithfully. Please don't do this." Ezekiel paused in his work, looking up at the 15-year-old with something that might have been compassion, if not for the blood on his hands. "My dear child, you will serve God faithfully. That is precisely the point. Without the burden of masculine desire, without the constant temptation of the flesh, you will be free to achieve a spiritual purity that ordinary men can never know." The Patriarch returned to his grisly task, and Thomas's screams gradually weakened to whimpers, then to a barely conscious moaning. Blood pooled on the floor beneath the chair, and the metallic scent filled the room, mixing with the smoke from the candles to create an atmosphere of pure nightmare. When it was finished, Ezekiel stepped back to admire his work. Thomas hung limply in his bonds, his face grey with shock and blood loss. The Patriarch moved to a basin of water that had been prepared earlier, washing his hands with the same care a surgeon might show after a successful operation. "One," he said simply, then turned his attention to Samuel. The second brother's ordeal was, if anything, worse than the first. Samuel fought against his restraints with desperate strength, his pleas for mercy echoing off the walls until his voice cracked and failed. Martha had stopped screaming, her throat too raw to produce sound, but tears continued to stream down her face as she watched her children being systematically mutilated. Outside, the wind had grown stronger, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the windows. It was as if the heavens themselves were weeping for the atrocity being committed in God's name. Benjamin, the youngest, watched his brother's suffering with an expression that had moved beyond terror into something approaching madness. When Ezekiel finally approached him, the 13-year-old spoke in a voice that was unnaturally calm. "You're not doing God's work," he said quietly. "You're a monster, and someday someone will make you pay for this." Ezekiel paused, his blood-stained hands hovering over his instruments. For a moment, something flickered in his pale eyes, uncertainty perhaps, or even fear. But then his expression hardened again. "The young often lack the wisdom to understand divine purpose," he replied. "In time, you will thank me for this gift." Benjamin's ordeal was the longest of the three, perhaps because his small body made the procedure more difficult, or perhaps because Ezekiel was growing tired. The boy's screams were higher, more piercing than his brother's, and they seemed to go on forever. When it was finally over, all three brothers hung unconscious in their chairs, their bodies broken and their innocence destroyed in the most literal sense possible. Ezekiel stood back, surveying his work with satisfaction. "It is done," he announced to the other men. "The purification is complete. These boys are now vessels of divine will, freed from the corruption of the flesh." Deacon Marsh looked sick, his face green in the candlelight. "Patriarch, they've lost so much blood. What if they don't survive? Then they will join the Lord in paradise, pure and unsullied." Ezekiel replied without concern. "But they will survive. The human body is remarkably resilient, and the Lord protects those who serve his purpose. Elder Crane finally released Martha, who immediately rushed to her sons. She checked each one frantically, her hands shaking as she felt for pulses and tried to assess their injuries. All three were alive, but barely. They needed medical attention immediately, but the nearest doctor was days away, and she doubted Ezekiel would allow her to seek help. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice hollow with shock and grief. "Now they heal," Ezekiel said, beginning to clean his instruments with methodical care. "And when they are recovered, they will take their places as the spiritual leaders of our community. They will be living examples of the purity that comes through sacrifice, inspiration to others who seek to serve the Lord with complete devotion. And if I tell people what you've done?" Martha's voice carried a note of desperate defiance. Ezekiel's smile was cold as winter frost. Who would believe such a tale? And even if they did, who would dare challenge the will of God as revealed through his chosen servant? "No, Sister Martha, you will remain silent. You will care for your sons as they heal, and you will help them understand the great gift they have received." The other men began to file out of the house, their white robes rustling in the candlelit darkness. None of them met Martha's eyes as they passed, and she realized with growing horror that this had been planned for some time. They had all known what was going to happen, and none of them had tried to stop it. As the last of the conspirators departed, Ezekiel approached Martha one final time. "I will send Brother Hale with a cart to transport your sons home," he said. "Tell anyone who asks that they fell ill with fever. In a few days, when they are stronger, we will announce their spiritual transformation to the community. They will be celebrated as saints, as living martyrs who gave their flesh for the glory of God." Martha looked down at her unconscious sons, their faces pale and drawn with pain, even in their senseless state. Thomas, who had dreamed of marrying Sarah Whitman and raising a family of his own. Samuel, who had shown such promise as a scholar and might have become a minister himself. Benjamin, barely more than a child, whose future had been stolen before he'd even had a chance to understand what that future might hold. "You've destroyed them," she whispered. "I have saved them," Ezekiel corrected. "And through their sacrifice, I have saved this entire community. You will understand in time, Sister Martha, when you see the spiritual heights they achieve, when you witness the purity of their devotion, you will thank me for this night's work." As he spoke, the storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the windows with increasing fury. Lightning illuminated the room in brief, stark flashes, and thunder rolled across the settlement like the voice of an angry god. But if the Almighty was indeed angry that night, his wrath was directed not at the sinful flesh of 3 innocent boys, but at the monster who had mutilated them in his name. And in the days to come, that divine anger would manifest in ways that Ezekiel Whitmore could never have anticipated. 3 days passed before the Blackwood boys regained consciousness. 3 days during which Martha barely slept or ate, tending to their wounds with supplies Brother Hale had reluctantly provided. The makeshift bandages were changed regularly, and she forced broth between their lips whenever they stirred, fighting to keep them alive through sheer maternal will. When Thomas finally opened his eyes on the 4th morning, the look he gave his mother was that of a stranger. Hollow, empty, as if something essential had been carved out of him along with his manhood. He said nothing for hours, simply staring at the ceiling of their small bedroom while Martha sat beside him, holding his hand and whispering words of comfort that felt like lies. Samuel awakened that afternoon, and his reaction was far more violent. He screamed when he realized what had been done to him, thrashing weakly against his blankets until Martha had to hold him down to prevent him from tearing open his wounds. His sobs echoed through the small farmhouse, a sound of such pure anguish that it seemed to seep into the very walls. Benjamin, the youngest, was the last to wake, and when he did, he simply looked at his mother with those 2 old eyes and asked, "Are we still alive?" The question haunted Martha more than any scream could have. What kind of existence awaited her sons now? What future could they possibly have in a world where their most basic humanity had been stolen from them? On the 5th day, Ezekiel came to visit, arriving at their door with the same measured steps and false compassion he had always shown. He wore his usual black coat and carried a leather satchel that Martha eyed with suspicion and fear. "How are our young saints recovering?" he asked, his voice carrying that same honey-over-steel quality that had once comforted her and now made her skin crawl. "They're alive," Martha replied curtly, blocking the doorway with her body. "Barely." "The Lord preserves those who serve his purpose," Ezekiel said, pushing past her into the house. "I've come to check on their progress and to discuss their future role in our community." In the bedroom, the 3 boys lay in their shared bed, propped up on pillows. Thomas stared at nothing, his face expressionless. Samuel turned away when Ezekiel entered, pulling his blanket over his head like a child hiding from monsters. Benjamin, however, met the Patriarch's gaze directly, and Martha was disturbed by the cold calculation she saw in her youngest son's eyes. "Excellent," Ezekiel pronounced after examining each boy in turn. "The healing progresses well. In another week, they should be strong enough to make their first public appearance as our community's newest spiritual guides." "They're not guides," Martha said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "They're victims. You've destroyed 3 innocent children. And for what? Some twisted interpretation of scripture that exists only in your diseased mind." Ezekiel's expression hardened. "Careful, Sister Martha. Blasphemy is a serious charge, and the punishment for it is severe. Your sons have been blessed with a sacred calling. They will serve as living examples of the purity that comes through sacrifice, and their presence will elevate the spiritual condition of our entire settlement. And if they refuse?" Benjamin spoke for the first time since awakening, his young voice carrying an edge that made both adults turn to look at him. "Refuse?" Ezekiel's laugh was genuinely amused. "My dear boy, what choice do you have? You are what you are now, and you cannot change that. You can either embrace your new role with grace and dignity, or you can spend your remaining years in bitterness and despair. I know which path the Lord would prefer you to choose." Over the following days, word of the boys' illness spread through the settlement, and neighbors began stopping by to offer assistance and inquire about their condition. Martha found herself forced to lie repeatedly, claiming that her sons had contracted a fever that left them weak and bedridden. The deception felt like poison in her mouth, but she knew that telling the truth would only bring more danger to her family. Mrs. Abigail Crane, the elder's wife, arrived with a pot of soup and a concerned expression. "Such a terrible thing," she said, settling her considerable bulk into a chair by the kitchen table. 3 strong boys struck down at once. "It's almost as if the Lord is testing your family, Martha." "Perhaps he is," Martha replied carefully, ladling soup into bowls, "though I confess I don't understand the purpose of such a test." Mrs. Crane leaned forward conspiratorially. "There are whispers, you know. Some say the boys were seen entering the Patriarch's house the night they fell ill. Others claim they heard strange sounds coming from that direction. Screaming, they say, though surely that's just the wind playing tricks." Martha's hand trembled as she set down the ladle. "People will gossip about anything. You know how rumors spread in a small community." "Indeed they do," Mrs. Crane agreed, but her eyes remained sharp and calculating. "Still, it's curious that Ezekiel has been so attentive to your family's needs lately, sending Brother Hale with supplies, visiting so frequently. One might almost think he feels responsible for their condition." The implication hung in the air between them, and Martha realized with growing alarm that she wasn't the only one who suspected the truth. If Mrs. Crane had noticed the connection, others might have as well. But what could any of them do? Ezekiel's authority was absolute, his word law in their isolated community. That evening, after Mrs. Crane had departed, Martha sat with her sons and tried to prepare them for what was coming. Thomas listened with the same empty expression he'd worn since awakening. Samuel wept quietly, his tears soaking into his pillow. Benjamin, however, seemed to be thinking, his young mind working through possibilities and consequences. "He's going to parade us in front of the whole settlement," Benjamin said finally. "He's going to claim we chose this, that we're happy to serve God in this way. And if we deny it?" Samuel asked through his tears. "Then we'll be branded as liars and blasphemers." Thomas spoke for the first time in days, his voice flat and emotionless. "He holds all the power here. We have no choice but to play along with his charade." Martha felt her heart breaking all over again. Her sons, who should have been planning their futures, courting young women and dreaming of families of their own, were instead calculating how to survive in a world that had been irrevocably altered by one man's madness. "There has to be something we can do," she said desperately. "Some way to expose him, to make people see what he really is." Benjamin looked at her with those ancient eyes. "Maybe there is, Mother, but it won't be easy, and it won't be quick. Men like Ezekiel don't fall overnight. They have to be brought down carefully, piece by piece, until their own weight crushes them." The words were chilling, coming from a 13-year-old boy, but Martha found herself nodding. If there was no justice to be found in their isolated settlement, perhaps they would have to create their own. The question was whether any of them would survive long enough to see it done. Outside, the autumn wind continued to blow, carrying with it the scent of coming winter and the promise of darker days ahead. But somewhere in that darkness, the seeds of retribution were already beginning to take root. Sunday morning arrived grey and cold, with frost covering the settlement's wooden structures like a shroud of false purity. Martha helped her sons dress in their best clothes, her hands shaking as she fastened buttons and straightened collars. Today was the day Ezekiel had chosen to present them to the community as living saints, and the very thought made her stomach churn with revulsion. Thomas moved like a man walking to his own execution, his face pale and expressionless. Samuel had stopped crying, but his eyes held a haunted quality that made Martha want to weep. Benjamin, however, seemed almost calm, as if he had made some internal decision that brought him peace. The transformation in her youngest son was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their entire ordeal. "Remember," Martha whispered as they prepared to leave the house, "we must be careful. One wrong word, one sign of defiance, and he could make things even worse for us." "Worse?" Samuel's laugh was bitter and hollow. "How could things possibly be worse?" Benjamin placed a gentle hand on his brother's arm. "They could kill us," he said simply, "and then no one would ever know the truth about what happened here." The walk to the meeting house felt like a funeral procession. Other families were making their way along the dirt paths, their conversations subdued and their glances furtive. Word had spread that something significant was going to be announced during the service, and the air crackled with nervous anticipation. Inside the meeting house, the Blackwood family was directed to seats in the front row, a position of honor that felt more like a pillory. Martha could feel the eyes of the entire congregation upon them, studying their faces for clues about what was to come. Behind them, she heard whispered conversations and the rustle of clothing as people craned their necks to get a better look. Ezekiel entered through a side door, resplendent in his finest black coat and carrying a Bible that seemed to gleam in the morning light. His pale eyes swept over the congregation before settling on the Blackwood family, and his thin lips curved into what might charitably be called a smile. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the packed meeting house, "today we witness a miracle. Today we see the power of faith made manifest in the lives of 3 young men who have chosen to sacrifice everything for the glory of God." A murmur ran through the congregation, and Martha felt her heart begin to race. This was it, the moment when Ezekiel would spin his web of lies and force her sons to participate in their own humiliation. "Thomas, Samuel, and Benjamin Blackwood have undergone a spiritual transformation. that few mortals are called to experience, the Patriarch continued. They have voluntarily surrendered the base desires of the flesh in order to achieve a purity of spirit that will serve as an inspiration to us all. The murmur grew louder, and Martha heard gasps of shock and confusion from the pews behind them. Ezekiel raised his hand for silence, and the meeting house fell quiet as a tomb. These young men have chosen the path of the ancient saints, the holy men who understood that true devotion requires the complete subjugation of carnal desire. They have undergone the sacred ritual of purification, removing from their bodies the source of masculine lust and pride. Now the gasps turned to cries of horror and disbelief. Several women covered their mouths with their hands, and Martha heard someone in the back of the meeting house whisper, "Dear God, he's talking about castration." "Rise, my young saints," Ezekiel commanded, gesturing for the three boys to stand. "Show your community the peace that comes with perfect purity." Thomas stood slowly, his movements mechanical and lifeless. Samuel followed, tears streaming down his face despite his efforts to remain composed. Benjamin rose last, and when he turned to face the congregation, his expression was serene, almost beatific. "Tell them," Ezekiel instructed. "Tell your neighbors and friends about the joy you have found in sacrifice." For a long moment, none of the boys spoke. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, and Martha could see Ezekiel's jaw tighten with impatience. Finally, Benjamin stepped forward. "We have been changed," he said, his young voice carrying clearly through the meeting house. "The Patriarch has shown us a path to spiritual elevation that few are privileged to walk. We are grateful for his guidance and for the opportunity to serve God in this special way." The words were perfect, exactly what Ezekiel wanted to hear. But something in Benjamin's tone, some subtle inflection that only his family would recognize, told Martha that her youngest son was playing a deeper game than anyone realized. Samuel managed to nod his agreement, though fresh tears continued to flow down his cheeks. Thomas said nothing, but his silence was interpreted as humble acceptance by those who didn't know him well enough to recognize the depth of hope in his eyes. "You see," Ezekiel proclaimed triumphantly, "these young men understand what so many fail to grasp, that the flesh is the enemy of the spirit, that true holiness requires the complete surrender of worldly desire. They will serve as our community's spiritual guides, living examples of the purity we should all strive to achieve." From the congregation came a mixture of responses. Some nodded in apparent approval, caught up in Ezekiel's rhetoric and the power of his presence. Others looked horrified, their faces pale with shock at what they were hearing. A few seemed confused, unsure whether to be inspired or appalled by this revelation. Mrs. Abigail Crane stood up slowly, her considerable bulk making the pew creak beneath her. "Patriarch," she said, her voice carrying a note of challenge that made everyone turn to look at her. "Are you saying these boys were mutilated? That they were castrated in the name of God?" Ezekiel's eyes flashed dangerously. "I am saying they were purified, Sister Crane. They underwent a sacred ritual that has been practiced by holy men throughout history. If you find fault with their choice, perhaps you should examine your own spiritual condition." "Choice?" Mrs. Crane's voice rose in pitch. "What choice does a 13-year-old boy have in such a matter? What choice does any child have when faced with the authority of adults who claim to speak for God?" The meeting house erupted in whispered conversations as people began to grasp the full implications of what had occurred. Martha saw several fathers pull their own sons closer, their faces grim with protective instinct. Some of the women were openly weeping, their maternal hearts breaking for the Blackwood boys. "Silence!" Ezekiel roared, his composure finally cracking. "I will not have the Lord's work questioned by those too spiritually blind to understand his purpose. These boys are blessed, chosen, elevated above the common mass of humanity. Anyone who suggests otherwise is guilty of blasphemy. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted, and Martha could see it taking root in the faces around her. For the first time since arriving in Salem's Edge, Ezekiel's absolute authority was being questioned, and the Patriarch clearly didn't know how to respond to such unprecedented defiance. Benjamin stepped forward again, his young face a mask of perfect innocence. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "those who doubt our joy in this sacrifice would benefit from experiencing it themselves. After all, if it is truly God's will, shouldn't all faithful men be willing to make the same offering?" The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge, and Martha saw several men in the congregation shift uncomfortably in their seats. Ezekiel's face went white, then red, as he realized the trap his youngest victim had just laid for him. "The Lord calls different people to different forms of service," the Patriarch said quickly. "Not all are chosen for such elevated sacrifice. But surely you, as our spiritual leader, would be the most worthy of such elevation." Benjamin pressed, his voice still carrying that same innocent tone. "Surely you would want to lead by example." The meeting house fell silent as everyone waited for Ezekiel's response. Martha held her breath, realizing that her 13-year-old son had just done something remarkable. He had turned the Patriarch's own twisted logic against him, exposing the hypocrisy at the heart of his actions. Ezekiel's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. The Lord has other plans for me. My role is to guide others to their proper sacrifice, not to, that is, I serve in a different capacity." The excuse sounded weak even to his own ears, and Martha could see the doubt spreading through the congregation like wildfire. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps her son's suffering would not be in vain. Perhaps the truth would finally come to light. But as she looked at Ezekiel's face, now twisted with rage and humiliation, she realized that their real ordeal was just beginning. A cornered animal was always the most dangerous, and the Patriarch had just been backed into a corner by a 13-year-old boy who was far more clever than anyone had realized. The confrontation in the meeting house marked the beginning of the end for Ezekiel Whitmore, though the Patriarch himself was too blinded by rage and wounded pride to see it. In the days following Benjamin's devastating challenge, the settlement buzzed with whispered conversations and furtive glances. Families who had once hung on Ezekiel's every word now questioned his authority, and the absolute power he had wielded for so long began to crumble like a foundation built on sand. Martha noticed the change immediately. Where once people had avoided her family out of fear or uncertainty, now they approached with expressions of sympathy and barely concealed outrage. Mrs. Crane visited daily, bringing food and supplies while carefully probing for more details about what had really happened that terrible night. Other women followed her example, creating an informal network of support that Ezekiel seemed powerless to stop. The men were more cautious in their rebellion, but even they began to show signs of dissent. Deacon Marsh, who had participated in the horrific ritual, now avoided eye contact with everyone and jumped at shadows. Elder Crane grew increasingly distant from his fellow conspirators, and Brother Hale was seen arguing with the Patriarch outside the meeting house, their voices raised in heated disagreement. Thomas, Samuel, and Benjamin recovered slowly from their physical wounds, but the psychological scars ran far deeper. Thomas remained largely silent, his spirit seemingly broken beyond repair. Samuel alternated between periods of deep depression and explosive anger, lashing out at anyone who tried to comfort him. But Benjamin seemed to be planning something. Martha often found her youngest son sitting by the window, staring out at the settlement with those two old eyes, his young mind working through possibilities and consequences. When she asked what he was thinking about, he would simply smile and say, "Justice, Mother." I'm thinking about justice. The first crack in Ezekiel's armor came when young Sarah Whitman, the blacksmith's daughter whom Thomas had been courting, publicly refused to attend Sunday services. When her father demanded an explanation, she declared that she would not worship in a place where children were mutilated in God's name. Her defiance inspired others, and soon the meeting house was noticeably less crowded on Sunday mornings. Ezekiel responded to this challenge with increasing desperation, his sermons becoming more violent and threatening. He spoke of divine punishment for those who questioned God's chosen representative, of plagues and disasters that would befall the unfaithful. But his words fell on increasingly deaf ears, and his authority continued to erode. The second crack came when a traveling merchant arrived in Salem's Edge with news from the outside world. The man, a grizzled trader named Josiah Fletcher, had dealt with the settlement for years and was shocked to learn what had transpired in his absence. "Castration," he said loudly in the general store, his voice carrying to everyone present. "You're telling me that madman castrated 3 children and called it God's work? That's not religion, friends. That's the work of a lunatic who belongs in chains." Fletcher's words carried weight because he came from outside their isolated community, representing a broader world where such actions would be seen as the crimes they truly were. His presence reminded the settlers that Salem's Edge was not the entire universe, and that there were authorities beyond Ezekiel's reach who might take a very different view of recent events. The final crack came from an unexpected source: Benjamin himself. 3 weeks after the confrontation in the meeting house, the youngest Blackwood boy requested a private meeting with the settlement's most influential families. Martha was terrified by the idea, fearing that her son was walking into a trap, but Benjamin assured her that he knew what he was doing. The meeting took place in the Crane family's large kitchen, with representatives from 8 of the settlement's most prominent households in attendance. Benjamin stood before them, still pale and thin from his ordeal, but with a strength in his voice that belied his 13 years. "I want to tell you what really happened that night," he began, and then proceeded to describe in horrifying detail the ritual that had been performed on him and his brothers. He spoke of the restraints, the surgical instruments, the blood, and the screams. He described how they had been forced to participate in their own humiliation, threatened with death if they refused to play along with Ezekiel's charade. When he finished, the room was silent except for the sound of several women weeping. Elder Crane, whose wife had organized the meeting, sat with his head in his hands, his massive frame shaking with what might have been sobs or rage. "Why are you telling us this now?" asked James Whitman, the blacksmith. "Why not speak out immediately?" Benjamin's smile was cold and calculating, an expression that should never have appeared on such a young face. "Because I needed time to heal, and I needed to watch. I wanted to see who would stand with him and who would turn away. I wanted to identify his allies and his enemies." "And what do you propose we do with this information?" Mrs. Crane asked gently. "I propose we give Ezekiel Whitmore exactly what he deserves," Benjamin replied. "I propose we show him the same mercy he showed to 3 innocent children." The room erupted in heated discussion. Some called for Ezekiel to be driven from the settlement immediately. Others wanted to send word to the colonial authorities to have him arrested and tried for his crimes. A few suggested more direct and violent solutions. But Benjamin raised his hand for silence, and remarkably, the adults quieted to hear what the child had to say. "Violence will only make us like him," he said quietly, "and involving outside authorities will bring unwanted attention to our community. No, what I have in mind is more appropriate to his crimes." Over the next hour, Benjamin outlined his plan with a precision that chilled everyone present. It was elegant in its simplicity and terrible in its justice, a punishment that would fit the crime in ways that even the most creative magistrate could never have devised. When the meeting ended, the conspirators dispersed to their homes with heavy hearts and grim determination. They had work to do, preparations to make, and a monster to bring to justice. 3 days later, on a cold November morning, Ezekiel Whitmore was awakened by a knock at his door. When he opened it, he found Elder Crane and several other men standing on his threshold, their faces hard as granite. "Patriarch," Crane said formally, "you are requested to attend an emergency meeting of the Settlement Council. There are matters of grave importance that require your immediate attention." Ezekiel, still groggy from sleep and unaware of the trap that had been laid for him, dressed quickly and accompanied the men to the meeting house. Only when he arrived and saw the crowd waiting inside did he begin to understand that something had gone terribly wrong. The entire adult population of Salem's Edge was present, their faces grim with purpose. At the front of the meeting house, 3 chairs had been arranged in a row, and in those chairs sat Thomas, Samuel, and Benjamin Blackwood, their presence a silent accusation that needed no words. "What is the meaning of this?" Ezekiel demanded, his voice cracking with the first hint of fear. Benjamin stood slowly, his young face serene with the terrible peace of the righteous. "The meaning, Patriarch, is justice. The meaning is that your reign of terror is over, and your victims are finally going to have their day of reckoning." You say, as the crowd closed in around him, Ezekiel Whitmore finally understood that the hunter had become the hunted, and that the children he had mutilated in God's name were about to show him exactly what divine justice looked like when wielded by mortal hands. The screams that echoed through the meeting house that morning were heard throughout Salem's Edge, but unlike the cries of 3 innocent boys weeks earlier, these screams found no sympathy among the listeners. When it was over, Ezekiel Whitmore had learned firsthand the meaning of the purification he had inflicted on others, and the settlement had finally been cleansed of the true corruption that had plagued it. In the years that followed, Salem's Edge would rebuild itself on foundations of genuine faith rather than twisted fanaticism. The Blackwood brothers would find their own paths to healing and purpose, forever changed but no longer victims. And the story of their ordeal would serve as a warning to future generations about the dangers of blind obedience to those who claim to speak for God while serving only their own dark desires. The truth, as Benjamin had promised, had finally come to light, and with it came a justice as terrible and complete as the crimes that had demanded